Why is proactive communication the secret weapon in short-term rental hosting?
Part of the game of guest communication is knowing your property well enough so that you can be proactive with some of the quirks that are unique to your property.
In this episode, we'd like you to meet my business partners in Smart Stay Coaching, Kory and Alex Steeg.
Whether they haven't looked at their phone, they lost their phone, there's no Wi-Fi, there are going to be these circumstances that come up. So one of the things that we always make sure is like a physical copy of whatever instructions you have about the home. Because if somebody shows up, for whatever reason, they can't use your home properly, you're going to have problems and that might lead to a bad review.
Did you know that your communication strategy could be the difference between getting all 5-star reviews and getting buried in the Airbnb algorithm?
What do you think the likelihood is if you have an issue of them responding to you? If you get locked out of the house at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and they have a bad response rate, what do you think the likelihood of them helping you get in the house in the middle of the night is going to be? So I look at that response rate, and that to me is already right off the rip, a really important thing. That if they have a bad response rate, I mean, that already tells me they're going to be bad communicators.
My name is Jason Muth. I'm a 30-time Airbnb super host. I worked in the media business for over 25 years, and in 2016, we bought our first short-term rental, which has turned into our chapter 2 in life. Since then, we've welcomed over 5,000 guests and their furry friends to our homes. And we're here to show you how to create a smart stay. Now, on with the show. All right, welcome to another episode of the Smart Stay Show. And we have a great roundtable today. We haven't introduced you to these guys just yet, but they're business partners of ours. And we're doing something called Smart Stay Coaching. We're going to have these guys on the podcast a lot coming up, in future episodes as well. But, please meet Alex Steeg and Kory. These guys are short-term rental experts. They're friends of mine. We share a lot in common. We live near each other. We all have little kids. And we're mired in this short-term rental world. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Yeah, officially, we finally have a roundtable. We talk all the time. I feel like we have a bit of a Lonely Hearts Club as dads. Sometimes we'll get together and, have some cocktails over at over in Linfield, talking about guests and owners and all the fun stuff that we all deal with. And I said we should get you guys on the pod on a regular basis. And we decided today we're going to talk about guest communication because these guys really know their stuff. They have been in this for many, many years. And we all approach guest communication in a similar but a different way, because all of our guests, kind of have different levels of demands and ask a lot of different things from us. But Alex, I got to start with you. Why do you say that guest communication and having an open dialogue with your guests is important?
Yeah. Expectation with life in general is critical. Most conflict that happens in life comes from a mismatch of what you expected and what you received. And so it's no different when we think about hosting people, whether that's through Airbnb or VRBO or direct bookings. People want to know exactly what they're going to expect, that there's not going to be a difference between what they expect and what they walk into. And so whether it's clearly communicating check-in instructions, any kind of quirks about the property, or if there's neighboring properties that have construction, being able to in advance and proactively communicate that so that your guests have clear and accurate expectations going in is ultimately going to set you up for success so that you're not going to, on the back end, be dealing with negative feedback, negative reviews, upset people because they didn't have a full picture of what they were going to be walking into. So clearly setting expectations via proactive communication is huge, not just in this, but in life as well.
Kory, don't you love how Alex just went so high level right there? He brought life into this. I hear him talking about SDR operations and he just takes it to a whole nother level.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I look at it a little bit differently, Jason, and at a more tactical level, right? For those of you that are SDR operators, Airbnb hosts, right? You're doing this to make money. But the two things that you need and the reasons you need to do that are you gotta have them have a great experience. People who are staying at your homes have to have a great vacation. For me, ethically, it's if you're marketing something or advertising something that people don't enjoy, it's not a great feeling. So for that reason, I think it's important. and financially, right? For those of you who want to be a host to make money, right? You need to actually have or maintain a certain level of rating, ideally as close to 5 stars as possible on Airbnb, to be able to do this over time. And if you aren't able to uphold that, right, uh, good guest experience or not, you're not going to be competitive on these tools now. And in a lot of these vacation markets, there are a lot of options, right? Jason, I know you have a pretty significant presence in Provincetown and Cape Cod. How many short-term rentals are in that tiny little niche of P Town right now?
Just under about 1,000
Yeah,
in the town. Yeah.
and what couple square miles,
Couple square
roughly?
miles. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
I never thought it was a huge market, but I guess it is a pretty big market compared to, some other places. I mean, in New Hampshire, some of the towns we operate in have 30, right? Like granted, you add the towns together, the towns that you're operating in, the towns that you own in, uh, and you can get up to 1,000 pretty quickly. But yeah, I know that one little zip code's got about 1,000 properties in Provincetown. And we found that people just have such a wide variety of levels of communication with the hosts. And I think it's important to have this communication because I think it nips questions in the bud, right? Like we'll answer questions as often as we can, and we get questions thrown at us all the time at all hours. But if you have like a good system where you're communicating with the guest about how to check in, where to park, what the Wi-Fi code is, all the different things that go into a guest experience, we think that it minimizes questions that they might have where they have to ask us the answer to that, and have us answer the question. Now, there's always going to be the hosts or the guests that will not be reading the materials that we send over to them. I mean, like how frustrating is that? You guys put together great guest guides, and then a lot of the questions get thrown at us. We're like, just look in the book, right? Like look on the interactive link. We're using TouchStay for our interactive guides. Like, what do you guys use? TouchStay.
TouchStay also.
Yeah. And there's just so much information in that guidebook that can answer somebody's question, but people sometimes lose links, they don't save it, they can't find the answer to something. It's easier for them just to ask us, so we never shame guests into oh, it's in the book, which could easily be a response that a less a less customer service friendly host might do. But we always do try to point them back in that direction, right? Like, hey, just make sure that you have the interactive guidebook. It does answer this question and many others. What are some questions that you get repeatedly that kind of make you roll your eyes and you're like, why do they keep asking the same questions? Like, how am I not communicating this correctly to guests?
Yeah, Jason, I just want to follow up on your comment about TouchStay, which is it's one of the industry standards of how people communicate information about their property. We've actually had guests check into homes where the Wi-Fi was out. Obviously not an ideal circumstance, but one of the things I think it's really important to do is make sure that you have a physical copy of your guidebooks at each property. This is a very debatable topic in the industry right now. But again, you're assuming that everybody has a smartphone, everybody has internet access, and sometimes, whether they haven't looked at their phone, they lost their phone, there's no Wi-Fi, there are going to be these circumstances that come up. So one of the things that we always make sure is a physical copy of whatever instructions you have about the home. Because if somebody shows up and for whatever reason they can't use your home properly, you're going to have problems, and that might lead to a bad review.
Yeah. Excellent point. I'm reminded of that. I walked into AAA here in Newburyport earlier today. I'm getting a license renewed, and I was probably the youngest person in that facility the entire time that I was there. And I'm certainly not young anymore, not like you guys. And I'm like, all right, well, these are the kind of people that I have to like make sure that we cater to. And the interactive guides are awesome for the us's. But that printed book that you're talking about, Kory, I bet you everyone that was in that AAA probably would prefer that printed book, because then again, all the things I was filling out were on printed documents there. And even the person behind the counter commented when I said, don't send me my Easy Pass statements by email. She's like, oh, you don't want a copy sent to you? I'm like, no. The printed world is, it's still relevant to lots of folks. And those printed guidebooks, I think, are super important. But going back to my question earlier, like, so Alex, what are some questions that you get a lot from people that you're like, it's in the book, but like, why are you still asking me this? But it still comes up.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the initial one that people often get is always going to be about parking. Obviously that's going to range. How often you get that question is going to range depending on the kind of property that you're renting. If you're renting a place that's kind of up in New Hampshire in the woods, lots of land on your own, you're probably not going to get that question too often. Where for us, we do rent some properties that are in downtown locations and some decent sized cities on the North Shore. And so one of the questions, especially for one of our properties, which is in downtown Salem, which gets crazy during Halloween, we have million plus visitors come in October. So that we often get questions about parking. Other questions are going to be for people who, kind of going back to your point, who aren't necessarily as familiar with kind of today's technology, is going to be, how do I use the smart lock? I'm not really sure. I've never used it before. How do I open, going back to the touch day, how do I open the guidebook? I've never clicked a URL before. And then generally speaking, a lot of the questions that we get too are going to be questions that we get once that person gets on the property. And so again, kind of to go back to the being proactive conversation, part of the game of guest communication is knowing your property well enough so that you can be proactive with some of the quirks that are unique to your property. So if you know that this particular stove is a little complicated to use, or maybe you just have a finicky heating and air conditioning system, being proactive to kind of think about those systems and documenting how exactly step by step you use those systems is going to be critical. But we get a lot of questions about parking, access, different appliances, that sort of stuff.
Trash. I get trash questions all the
Yep.
time. Yeah, I don't know where to
Yep.
put the trash.
Recycling. Do you guys recycle here?
Yeah. Are you asking me? I mean, at home I do, but not my property.
No, I get that a ton. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's the recycling can?
We get the trash a lot. Like we get I can't find the trash shed. And, it behooves me because I feel like it's pretty clearly explained as to where it is. Like, no, it's not right outside the door, but we do explain where it is. But people still ask that question. And, it tells me that not everyone reads everything. And I shouldn't feel like I shouldn't get angry at guests if that's the case. I just have to have that expectation as a host that some stuff will get missed because these are people that are transient. They're coming in for a couple days, and I shouldn't expect them to know all the intricacies of my property. I think a lot of the marketing that the hotels do against Airbnb and Vrbo, in fact, there's marketing that Vrbo does against Airbnb about communication. Like there's a commercial campaign happening right now where a guest shows up and there's someone kind of welcoming them, but explaining all these things they can't do at the property. Like, don't do this, don't do that. Then they have this like mortified look on their face. And it was a Vrbo campaign against Airbnb because they were kind of painting Airbnb as the shared space provider. But with that said, lots of rules go into all these properties, and we put these rules and we put this information in guidebooks, and we try to be proactive with our guests, but we can't expect them to know everything. And that is a ding against hosts because we do have we try to keep checkout simple, just do this short list of things. But some people can't even accomplish that short list of things for whatever reason. They're running out the door early to catch a flight. They have kids running around and they just can't be bothered with it. They forget, or they just choose to ignore it. And, even though we're giving that communication to them, we as hosts should expect that sometimes those things will get missed. And whether or not you feel like strongly against that guest as a result, or whether you could just kind of let it, slide over your head, that's on you as a host. But, let's talk a little bit about, the proactive and the reactive ways that people can receive communication. So, Kory, you were talking a little bit earlier about, how it's important to stay, inform your guests and tell them exactly what's happening at your property. What are some things that you do before somebody shows up at the property to get them comfortable with where they're about to stay?
Yeah, no, great question. So just to comment quickly about questions, a lot of people have negative kind of visceral reactions like, oh, this person's asking a guest, oh, they didn't read the instruction manual. And while those things do happen, it's a really good opportunity to learn about your guests. And again, no matter how good you think your guidebook is, your instructions are, if you get asked the same question multiple times, there's probably an opportunity, back to Alex's comment, to be even more explicit about your detail,
Mhm.
right? So for parking, can you do an aerial shot where you have a highlighted square showing exactly where you need to park with an arrow pointing to the square? It sounds like it's overkill, but again, using these guests and those interactions as an opportunity to optimize your processes is something that if you can reframe kind of your mindset around that, it's actually a really good opportunity. But Jason, to answer your question directly, we do, while we like questions, we also do everything we can to avoid them or give people the answers they need before they have those questions. So we use a property management system called Hospitable to actually automate what we call our proactive guest management. So we have 5 core types of messages that we send to basically every guest, right? Um, just to rattle off the 5 really quickly, it's booking confirmations. Hey, when somebody signs up to book your property and they're spending thousands of dollars, send them an automated message. Just like if you purchase something on Amazon, it's a really good. You're acknowledging that you've received the request and you're looking forward to their stay. That's it. Just a brief recap. Usually about 3 days before check-in, again, somebody can book your property a year in advance, 6 months in advance, or a day in advance. 3 days prior to check-in, we usually send pre-check-in instructions, which is a lot more detail about how to actually use the property. What is the physical address? What is the security codes to actually get in? And we usually include a link to our guidebooks. A lot of folks ask why 3 days, right? We don't like to give out a physical address to a property more than 3 days in advance because of security reasons, right? We don't want to be giving out that information until we know they are definitive confirmed check-in. The third one is probably the most controversial and maybe the most ironic, but we actually ask guests 4 hours after they check in, how's your stay going? What questions do you have? We proactively go to them and say, what questions do you have for me, right? And the reason we do that is that if they're actually not having a great experience, right, we want to be able to address that. Maybe they don't know how to use, they know how to adjust the temperature. Maybe they don't know how to use the TV. Reach out to them and ask those questions. More often than not, they'll send a message back saying they're having a great time. It's a validation that you're providing them a good guest experience, which is critical to anybody who's an Airbnb or STR host. The last 2, we do pre-checkout instructions. So before you're checking out, we actually have depending on the property, right, a somewhat detailed checklist of everything you need to do before you check out. And then last but not least, we always go back to the guests and ask for reviews, right? Whether you had a good stay or you didn't, we hope you did. But if you didn't, we actually want to hear back as to why. So if there are things about your experience that weren't good, rather than wait for the next guest to report out on this, we want to be able to address that swiftly and promptly. Whether it's a maintenance issue, the heating wasn't working, they didn't have access to the pool. We want to know about that so we can address that immediately so that our next guests have an even better experience. That's it. And a lot of that, to kind of create the flywheel, a lot of that proactive communication is optimized based on the questions that we get from guests, right? So back to the parking comment that Alex made. If people keep asking questions about parking, that's an indicator to me that maybe we need to make our pre-check-in instructions a little bit beefier around parking. So anyways, apologies for the long-winded answer, Jason, but those 5 key facets I think are really important, and we can debate the nuances of each one, but generally that's worked well for us.
We're doing something really similar. Alex, do you have a similar cadence of messages with your guests?
Yeah, exactly what Kory described. The only difference for us is that instead of the check-in message that Kory described gets sent out 4 hours after check-in, we actually do a morning after. So the first morning after they've stayed there is when we have that message going out. And the reason that I like having it on the back end after the next morning is we have guests checking in at all hours of the day. And so the thing that I think sometimes can happen when you do start to have a lot of automated messages going out is that it can feel a little robotic at times. And so when you have a message that's going sent, 4 hours after, let's say check-in's at 5 o'clock, you have an auto message getting sent out at 9. That person has communicated in advance that they're not checking in until 11 p.m., midnight. I had someone recently check in at 2 a.m. I want to make sure that that message comes across as human as possible. And so we'll send that next morning after we know for sure that that person has checked in and that they've stayed a night. But we do everything else the same that Kory described.
Yeah, we do as well. We've had folks from Hospitable on this podcast, and I have given some feedback. They're great with feedback, by the way. I'm sure that you guys put some things on their product roadmap. It doesn't mean they all get done, but I at least feel like we get heard. I said to Hospitable, man, it would be great if there was a way that you could automatically delete that morning after message if there's been communication that happened beforehand. And they're not there yet with that, but I'm sure it's something on their product roadmap because I just feel like a doofus sometimes if like I've had a back and forth dialogue with somebody after they check in on night one, and then the next morning, even worse, actually, like the second morning, like let's just say before that 11 a.m. message goes out, because I said mine at 11, like they send me something at like 10. It's just a question or whatever it is. And we go back and forth. And then like the stupid auto message goes out at 11 that I forgot to turn off, right? Because it's a manual process. You got to turn that thing off. But the fact that we're all doing this message cadence is much different from what I was doing before I leveled up understanding short-term rental hosting, by joining Short-Term Rental Secrets Mastermind, which we're all familiar with. When I was individual host of one property and then two properties, everything was manual. Like literally it was cutting and pasting and adding PDFs onto an email that I would send to people when they checked in. And then I wouldn't talk to them at all until they talked back to me. I don't even think I sent messages about, like a check-in message or I don't even think that I sent messages, for checkout. Like I just relied on whatever was sent out by Airbnb or Verbo, if anything. And I think, you guys might know this, but the platforms themselves have their own messages, right? That we don't even see through Hospitable, or do they not?
I'm not sure.
Good question.
One thing I would say in my time with Hospitable that's really impressed me is some of their new AI features around responses to you guys. So in the case that you do get asked a question that isn't covered with some of your the guest communications you've already sent out, I mean, a lot of times now when I'm responding to messages, Hospitable has this nice little feature that says reply with AI, and it'll actually make a recommendation for a response based on what the guests ask, and it will look at your historical transcripts from that property. So if previous guests have asked that question, you've already responded to it, it'll use that to learn and actually apply that to the question that you're asked. So again, when you're getting asked questions, for me, it's about, again, ensuring that you get that guest experience. But for me, as a dad, as somebody with a full-time job, I also want to minimize the time that I'm spending dealing with these questions or issues. A lot of times now for me, it's down to a single click where I'm reviewing a message that's already written for me and clicking reply with AI through Hospitable. So going back to your question about, I wish there was a way that if I'd already been talking to them after their check-in at 4 p.m. on Friday, and the message is going out at 10 a.m., I guarantee you if that gets prioritized, that will be a feature in the near future, without question.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about like what bad hosts are doing. Like why we're good because of bad people, right? Well, you're good because you're good, but sometimes like in relation to other people, you look even better. And a lot of times short-term rental people that stay in our properties will have bad experiences with other hosts. And it helps us look even better if we have some degree of competency, which I think we all do. But what do you think the bad hosts are doing?
Alex, you want to start with that one?
Host. Yeah, I got a quick one. Really simple, and you can kind of get an idea if you're gonna if I'm a guest and I'm looking at someone's listing, I have a pretty good sense if someone's going to be a bad host without even making a reservation and just looking at their profile. If you scroll down on that person's listing, you're going to come to a little section that has their picture, and it's going to say a response time. Bad hosts don't respond, and it'll show you how quickly that response typically is from that host. If they can't even respond to inquiries and people who are saying, hey, I'm interested in booking your house, what do you think the likelihood of, if you have an issue, of them responding to you? If you get locked out of the house at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, and they have a bad response rate, what do you think the likelihood of them helping you get in the house in the middle of the night is going to be? So I look at that response rate, and that to me is already right off the rip, a really important thing, that if they have a bad response rate, I mean, that already tells me they're going to be bad communicators.
Mm-hmm. Kory, what do you think makes a bad host in communication?
I'll bring it back to one of my first comments, which is about the experience. And a lot of people talk about properties and, does it have granite countertops and certain types of flooring or certain views. You're going to see all that in the pictures. And believe it or not, there are guest avatars for uber luxurious properties and economic properties, budget properties that people want to go to stay for 100, $200 a night. The full spectrum exists, right? So if guests can uncover that as part of the photos, and there are properties that will suit certain guests and properties that will not, it comes back to the experience for me. I know the kind of place I'm getting. I've got good photos. I know what I'm getting into. Then to me is really the experience part is what is my physical experience when I walk into this property, right? What do I smell? What do I see? And part of that is going back to guest communication, how we as hosts teach them to use the property. If you have a beautiful home, as I think, not to name names, but there are some very large property managers with thousands and thousands and thousands of properties, and they are beautiful. They're probably some of the nicest homes in the world, right? Why do they get bad ratings? It's because the people behind the curtains who are actually responsible for the experience are quite literally not there, or they're going to a call center. And that leads to a bad experience. If I don't know, Alex, I think you brought up an oven. If I'm staying there with my family and I cannot cook a meal in that kitchen, that is a bad experience. Some people will deal with it as guests. Some people will be more vocal, but in general, that is on us as hosts to convey that. So again, one of the first things I always do before I book an Airbnb or a short-term rental for myself or my family, pictures is one piece of the puzzle. The other one, to Alex's point, is doing some research on the host, and you can see that through their profile. And also reading the comments about the property, because once you get past, 1, 3, 5 check-ins, you've got 30, 50, 100, 200 reservations with guest reviews. They're going to tell the truth. Are you going to get a couple people that are going to be overly opinionated one way or the other? Yes. But the consensus is going to flush out. So that's always something that I look at. And over time, those reviews don't lie.
Mm-hmm. And, I've always found that being more communicative tends to lead to better reviews and more frequent reviews. And it's always good to kind of pepper in the word 5-star throughout your communications. I hope you've had a 5-star experience. We take, 5-star hosting, seriously, whatever, throw it in there and just try to get that into their head, so ultimately they'll give you that 5-star. I try to communicate with people. Well, there's two things. Like, I want them to understand that we own the property or we're co-hosting the property. Like, we're in charge, right? We are. You're our guest. You're our guest. We're welcoming you, but there are going to be some things that we need you to know about the property. And we're not going to let the guests kind of just run amok throughout the property if they don't know what the rules are. We want to make sure that they understand quiet hours, that they understand that we're part of a community of people that live here full time, et cetera, et cetera. But we always do it in a firm, sometimes friendly, sometimes funny tone. I've also read the tone that people put in their listing descriptions and in the information that they convey. And you can get a sense as to how they're going to be as a host with the type of language that they're using. I think the language should be firm, but sometimes you can get cheeky and sometimes you can get funny, and sometimes you can put some personality into it. But if you're going to be that very lawyerish, or you're going to be that, that host that's just saying, no, 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 here are the things you can't do. Make sure you do this, know this, big capital letters, whatever, then that's going to come across that way. And I think people might shy away from wanting to book your property just based on the written tone of some of that communication. With that said, I try to match the communication to what I get back from the guest. So is this going to be a chatty guest? Sometimes we get the chatty guests, right? Like where you're getting long messages, and then you respond, and then you could see on the app, they're responding immediately. And then suddenly you're going back and forth and back and forth. One of the great things that Airbnb at least introduced into their app AI recently is just the ability to put that little smiley face or heart or thumbs up, which we all know is the universal sign of, okay, I'm done with this conversation. That is something that I've used a lot lately. I forget, do you know Hospitable has that in their software, or is that just an Airbnb thing?
I believe you can. I feel like
Can
I've given some thumbs up in the past.
Thumbs up, which is like, yep, heard you, I'm moving on. But there'll be some guests. What do you do about the guests that don't write back at all? Like we all have those, where we're sending out our automated messages. We think that they're getting them, but we don't know because they're not responding back at all. Like what do you do with those kind of guests?
Well, first off, I actually just learned this morning that if you have an automated message that isn't successfully sent through Hospitable, you actually get a message about it. So I had received that wonderful news this morning about guests we have checking in later the week. So assuming your messages have been sent, and you'll be notified if they don't. A lot of people think of this experience like they do a hotel. Like, hey, I'm going to get my key card or whatever security code that's sent to you a few days prior. I got the address. I'm good. I don't need anything from you guys. And it's a little nerve-wracking, especially for newer hosts. But if you've provided them the information they need and they've paid you money for that stay, they're going to stay. And also, people are very good about letting you know if there's an issue, right? There is something catastrophic. I can't get into the house. The Wi-Fi doesn't work. They're going to let you know about it. We get messages. We get phone calls occasionally, right? People reach out if there's problems. So I don't want to say silence is golden, but some people are not super communicative. That doesn't necessarily mean they're having a bad experience. I do think it's the responsibility of us as hosts to still proactively check in, even if they're not engaging, make sure they have the information they need to have a great experience and a great stay.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to throw last word for guest communication over to Alex. What's one piece of advice you'd give to a newer host or someone that's been hosting for under a year as to how they could dramatically improve their guest communication game?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm going to go back to the overall guest experience and kind of going back a little bit to what I talked about before in terms of just kind of knowing your property, setting those expectations. Whenever everyone thinks that their house that they live in or the house that they're renting out is completely normal, that there's no quirks, that it's like a completely normal experience. Everything works exactly how it's intended. And so one of the things I encourage people when they are thinking about renting a home out is to actually have people stay there, have friends, family stay there, experience the property, have them come up with that list of quirks or questions or issues that they had so that you already have kind of this little test sample of questions that you're probably going to get answers to that you can be proactive on in coming up with your canned messages. One of the great things about Hospitable is, yes, like Kory was talking about, you have those AI responses. It'll understand your history of how you've responded to things in the past. One of the other things that you can do is you can auto load responses to common questions that you probably are going to get called canned responses. And so that's the other thing that you can kind of do on the front end is, it's never usually convenient when a guest is reaching out about questions. And to be able to save yourself the time of having to manually type out that message over and over and over again, and to just click on the canned message, scroll down to the appropriate one, click send, is a huge time saver. I think it also saves frustration on the host perspective, so that you're not starting to get frustrated or bitter towards your guests when, they don't read something and you're just answering it manually for the 100th time. But having that test sample, I think, helps then to allow you to be proactive with your communication.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you bring up the great point about AI and canned responses. And it gets me thinking, if you, a listener, viewer of this podcast, are hosting the same way today that you did a year and a half or 2 years ago, then you've probably missed out on some of the new technology that's available. And then we'll probably be able to say the exact same thing a year or two later. So if we're, if you look back and say my systems are identical to when I started, whether that was a year or 2 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever, you've been missed. Meaning that there's other stuff that has passed you in terms of the way that you can make your life more efficient and your guest life more efficient. And it's important to stay on top of these trends. And we're hoping that, we introduce some of that stuff here at Smart Stay Show. Thank you guys for appearing on this podcast. Finally, this is the Smart Stay coaching crew. Okay. So we got Kory, Alex, and myself. If you want to learn more about the work that we're doing, you can go to smartstaycoaching.com and learn about how we could help you launch your short-term rental property or make it even better through the experience that we have and the expertise that we provide. We will have you guys on the podcast on a very regular basis. This is the first of many episodes that we're going to have with Alex and or Kory. Thank you, fellas, for appearing. It's a long time coming. We've talked about this for a while. Really, really glad to have you on the pod.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for listening or reviewing this. If you've enjoyed the podcast, we love 5-star reviews. We love all your comments. And if you want to be a guest on the show, go to smartstayshow.com. I'm Jason. I'll see you.